listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon. Orinoco Tribune has a very interesting piece entitled "Sudan's Left is Skeptical of U.S. Saudi-Led Peace Talks. The resolution has to be found here in Sudan." The Sudanese Communist Party argues that the ceasefire mainly serves the warring parties who can resupply their forces and resume fighting with greater intensity. For insight into this and other issues, let's turn to my next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled Revolting Capital: Racism and Radicalism in Washington, D.C., 1900 to 2000. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So this piece continues. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia have been hosting the talks between SAF and RSF in Jeddah since May 6th. And they said in a joint statement late in June that the two parties had agreed to allow the unimpeded movement and delivery of humanitarian assistance. But one of the complaints from the side of the Sudanese Communist Party is that the relief is not being allowed in and getting to the people that need it, and that they are concerned that fighting will further intensify after this new ceasefire ends. Your thoughts? What really seems to be at the crux of the problems here, Dr. Horne?
Well, I think the Sudanese Communist Party has good reason to be suspicious of both Washington and Riyadh, of the United States and Saudi Arabia, because during the preceding epoch, not only were these two titans the major promoters of the wildly and hysterically anti-communist Cold War, which had a devastating impact on Sudan, not least the Sudanese Communist Party, but their interference, speaking of Washington and Riyadh's interference in the internal affairs of Saudi Arabia, continues to this very day. And both the United States and Saudi Arabia have not given up on their long-time ambitions of basically stymieing any kind of social progress in Sudan that would tend to circumscribe the needs and wishes of foreign capital. Recall, as we've said on these airwaves more than once, that during the preceding epoch, the Cold War, the Sudanese Communist Party was one of the strongest communist parties on the African continent, second only to South Africa, which is now in government with the African National Congress in Pretoria. But alas, Washington unleashed its Cold War machinations against the Sudanese Communist Party, and like a seesaw, that helped to give rise to various kinds of religious zealotry, including the stationing in Khartoum, Sudan, of the notorious Osama bin Laden, which then gives Washington another excuse to interfere in the internal affairs of Sudan, and so it goes. And so the Sudanese Communist Party has good reason to be skeptical, and your listeners should realize that one of the many reasons for this anti-communist hysteria was that the Sudanese Communist Party was part of an international movement of communist parties that was seeking to have a worldwide socialist regime, a worldwide socialist revolution in every country. And that was deemed as too powerful to contend with, which then leads to this Red Scare, the Cold War, and the moment we're presently enmeshed in.
Switching gears, in this story, I think, is going to have impact on the other stories, subsequent stories that we discuss. This is from Orinoco Tribune. Obama says, Merkel and I pressured Europe to impose sanctions against Russia. Former U.S. President Obama stated in an interview with CNN that it was only thanks to him during his time in the White House and to Angela Merkel as German chancellor that Ukraine was able to prepare for war against Russia, a confession that confirms once again that the Minsk agreements were a strategy to give Kiev time to strengthen itself. This I find to be disturbing, and a disturbing admission on a number of levels, because looking at where we are now and how we got here, looking at this failure in Ukraine, now we see Obama's hands admittedly, many suspected, but admittedly, all over this mess. And what it also, and particularly in the kind you just mentioned, Gaddafi, we know the failure of the Obama administration's assassination of Gaddafi, and it also shows an inability of introspection, because you sit here now and you look at this mess. You couldn't have planned, Mr. President, that this was going to be the outcome. And so you look at this out, it's almost as though you've now been given the test. You failed the test, and you can't even figure out the calculus that you used. You couldn't solve for X. I could ramble on for another hour about this. Help me out here, Dr. Horne. Am I off base here?
Well, no, I don't think so. And I think it reveals certain contradictions in the discourse of the former U.S. president, Mr. Obama. Recall that it was Mr. Obama, in a now famous interview with The Atlantic, who suggested before this Ukraine crisis began to bubble over that it would be unwise for Washington to get heavily involved in Ukraine because, to use his phrase, Russia had escalatory dominance. He was referring to the fact that Russia's population is about 3 or 4 or 5 times the size of Ukraine, that that Moscow has a mature arms production industry that by some measures is really outstripping today as we speak the arms production industry in terms of producing artillery, for example, and artillery shells, than all of the NATO countries combined. And so now, to give this subsequent interview, I guess he's trying to get in accord with the policy of his successor, Mr. Biden. But in fact, he's only confusing the picture. And I think that the United States, no matter how you cut it, would be better served if he had stuck with his original premise that escalating in Ukraine was a blunder.
Consortium News has a piece by Vijay Prashad, Can Europe Break Free of Atlanticism? Europe has every reason to support the development of an independent foreign policy that rejects U.S. dominance and militarization in favor of embracing international cooperation and a more democratic world order. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, I think Europe is sort of caught betwixt and between. On the one hand, there is a gnawing and growing recognition that tailing after Uncle Sam leads to disaster. That's an important lesson to be gleaned from the crisis in Ukraine. But at the same time, as events are developing, it appears that China is growing by leaps and bounds, and therefore, if Europe is not careful, it too will be ruling the day that China became the unrivaled number one. That would be seen in some circles in Brussels as inimical to the interests of the European Union. So I think that the fact that Europe is caught between these two poles will probably lead to Europe pursuing contradictory, if not incoherent policies. And you see this on the one hand with regard to Europe, speaking of Berlin, the locomotive of the European Union, entertaining the Chinese prime minister who was just there a few days ago, the premier, I should say, but at the same time seeking to pursue this policy of de-risking, their term, not mine, with regard to China, that is to say trying to circumscribe their relationship with the People's Republic of China because of fear of becoming too reliant upon Chinese supply chains, upon Chinese exports, upon China as a market for Germany, etc. And so Europe is trapped in a sense. However, I would tell the folks in Brussels that pursuing this goal of tailing after Uncle Sam, there lies catastrophe.
And how long can they continue with this Gordian knot that they seem to want to tie as Macron is trying to go to the BRICS meeting and Moscow saying, no, I don't think it would be a good idea for you to come. We know that the United States plan to deindustrialize Germany and thereby deindustrializing Europe. We know that the United States blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. So you've got France and Germany and other countries seemingly trying to placate and develop and establish their trading relationships with China, and at the same time trying to keep this barking dog at their door from coming in their house and tearing up their couch. We got about 2 minutes.
Well, I think you've summed it up rather nicely. And I think one indicator to keep a close and careful eye on is the natural gas market. I think inevitably this crisis in Ukraine was driven by natural gas predators along the Gulf of Mexico coast in the United States of America. That is to say, they were
Thank you, Congressman Ted Cruz.
Exactly. They've been very upset with the fact that Gazprom, the Russian giant, had developed a kind of monopoly in their minds on natural gas exports to Germany and to Europe. And this was seen as at odds with the natural gas interests in Texas and Louisiana. And voila, what do you have? You have a rupture between Berlin and Moscow, which history has shown can be quite dangerous to the fortunes of Europe as a whole. And if you look at the contracts that are being signed, you see natural gas interests in the United States signing 20-year contracts with their interlocutors, with their trading partners in Western Europe. That's going to hamper Russia-EU relations. But, of course, Russia is not necessarily harmed because they can just turn around and export eastward into China, which is a bigger market by several orders of magnitude than the European Union market. But in any case, once again, Europe is trapped. And once again, despite the dangerous signals that come from developing a deepening relationship with Washington, NATO suggests that Europe is not necessarily able to work itself out of this crisis.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.